The 80s had the General. The 90s had John Gilligan. In the noughties, it was the reign of Martin Marlowe Hyland. His was a familiar path with success and power, and then the recklessness. He had to go, because with him, an innocent young man doing an honest day's work died. Crime World presents Caught in the Crossfire, the unsolved murders of coke kingpin Marlowe Hyland and innocent Anthony Campbell. Available now on all podcast platforms. Like, for the size of these microphones, you have to talk so close to them, don't you? You expect them to be super duper, that they could pick up sound anywhere.
Our sound engineers just want to make our listeners feel like they're getting into an intimate conversation with you anyway. I don't know about me. But
well, no, you're close enough too. I've been sort of ordered by Clodagh to keep my mic here. But anyway, James Mago Gately has kind of reached the end of the road with this cab battle that he undertook in order to keep his home.
Yeah, it was going on since 2021. And actually, Judge Owens mentioned that in his judgment yesterday, saying, you know, it dragged on for so long because they consistently failed to listen to the orders of the court and meet the deadlines for when affidavits were to be filed, you know, about...
They being his legal team? Like.
Well, it's on the instructions of James Mago Gately and his partner, Charlene Lam. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there was a constant delay. To recap the kind of what went on, it was all about the house that was bought in the house in Glynn Drive in Coolock that was bought for 125,000 and 440,000 spent on refurbishing it, doubling the size of it, you know, done to a very high standard, big heavy steel door at the front, obviously to protect himself from any former gangland associates who might have fallen out with him. So, I mean, it went on. First of all, there was the free legal aid application, and that took a while. There was back and forth with the affidavits on, you know, their income and so on. And then when that was finally got over that hurdle, then there was the big delay about trying to find a quantity surveyor and a forensic accountant that were going to do reports. Now, the forensic accountant, for all the delay that it took, came up with a figure that was €2,000 different from the one that was done by the surveyor that was hired by the Criminal Justice Bureau. And then I just noticed in the judgment that not only was it only $2,000, it was never actually filed as an affidavit in the end. It was only an unsworn copy that was forwarded to the court. So he actually just ignored it, Judge Owen said. So and he kind of said that he didn't say it in so many words, but he kind of more or less said that they should really have engaged, because he said there are kind of questions over some of the mortgage payments, because Charlene Lam got a €48,000 compensation claim. And in his judgment yesterday, he said that any sale of the house, any proceeds from the sale of the house, at least something like 6,500 will go back, because that was definitely attributable to non-criminal cash. And then he said there was no evidence put forward by either side on how mortgage repayments were made, if any, from 2019, and therefore he basically invited them to make a submission on the next day. Yeah. To decide whether or not
they're owed anything,
if they're owed anything, if the house is even when the house is sold off or taken possession of.
But I mean, the 6,000's pocket change compared to the value of this house. So it's obviously not worth 440,000 plus 125,000, because you're not going to get the full refurbishment money back. But it's probably, what are we guesstimating, about 300, 350?
I think that was kind of the price, 340, wasn't it? I think was kind of the highest in the area. But look, it was done to a high standard, and you know, it was commented as well in the judgment yesterday that it was done to a very high spec. And he did so because he was trying to make the point that Gately's argument that he carried out most of the work himself and Charlene's father helped. You know, he said, look, that's not how it works. You know, plus they had all the emails that go back and forth with an architect to show that, you know, this is a professional building job and it wasn't done with the help of family and friends. And slowly it was done quite quickly. So I mean, I suppose that was the whole reason behind pointing out the fact that it was a very nice job.
And had they been living here?
Yeah, as far as we know, Charlene has definitely been living there. Now, like in the 4-year period that CAB were investigating them and going through their finances, so which I suppose is from around 2016 to or even before that, to about 2019, 2020, he commented that they were barely ever in the state. They seemed to spend most of the time abroad or in airport termini, as they were moving between
the Regency Hotel.
It would have been before and after. And because there was one cruise to the Caribbean in 2016. And then there was another one, the one in 2018, which we first heard about in with the legal aid application, I think 2 years ago at this stage. Like in that one, they went on a cruise that took in a load of places in around the Pacific Rim. Like went to Japan, started in Singapore, Vietnam, all of that, and it was a balcony room, so it wasn't cheap.
What a trip!
And the point was as well, he, as Judge Alex Owen does, he in his judgments, it goes through in fine detail in his 42-page judgment about all the different transactions, and was basically making the point that on some of these trips there was no sign of any activity on their cards, on their bank cards. So they had other ways of paying for what they were doing, whether it was cash or bank accounts from in foreign countries or whatever way they did it.
Is that traceable? Have you ever heard of Revolut coming up in
it came up in this. Yeah, because there was payments made to Charlotte on her Revolut account in relation to her business. And again, it was part of a kind of a cumulative kind of pattern that I think the judge, saw in the way their bank accounts were being used, that mortgage payments were being made, but cash payments were going into different AIBs, one on Capel Street and one on O'Connell Street under Mago Gately's name. And this was being used. So there was no explanation where that money was coming from. And like his own declared income, he had a hairdressing business with a former business partner. And he was saying at one stage, he was making 600 quid a week. And therefore he was living off of 200 and saving 400. And this is how certain things were paid for. So all of this wasn't found credible. And even Charlotte Lam's her income from her business was it rarely got up to 5 figures. It was always 6,000, 10,000, 11,000. She's a beautician. And she also had a fair amount of income from social welfare as well. This is all kind of noted in the judgment, and it's in some of the affidavits that we would have previously seen when the case was, heard. The full hearing was only in March. So, it's been relatively quick. Once the kind of, I suppose, the game kicked off, Joe Jones got down to it and delivered his 42-page judgment. But he said there was a few things he wasn't entirely convinced about, and he was saying that he couldn't make a decision on some aspects because there was no evidence brought forward. And this is in terms of some relatively minute enough transfers of 3,000, 4,000 euro and stuff like that. But what was the subject of the cab case was the house in Glyn Drive, a Volkswagen Passat and a Rolex watch. And he basically he more or less accepted. He accepted the belief evidence, from the Criminal Assets Bureau. The Rolex watch, Charlene had said in her evidence that she bought it from a friend of her father's for something like 1,100 or 1,200, and he said that just wasn't credible. He says this watch is worth 4,400 back then, and Rolexes hold their value. He knows his designer goods, as we know, and he wasn't buying it. So
you'd wonder, okay, everybody who is in loss to the Criminal Assets Bureau are going to feel sore about it. But I think if they had to lose anything, surely that house in Dublin was it. We don't know what else they possess or how they've paid for all these flash holidays and all the rest of it. We do know that James Mago Gately would be seen as a member of the Hutch organised crime group. We don't know what wealth maybe he has outside Ireland or hidden away. But that house, he has survived 2 assassination attempts. One which was planned and plotted by the Byrne organised crime group headed up by Thomas Bomber Kavanagh and involved Imre Arakas, been flown into the country, the international hitman. That was foiled because Gardaí trailed him from the airport and arrested him. But some months later, if even was a month later, he was shot.
Was May in 2017. The first one was in April.
Yeah, so that's when he was a month later. He was shot by Caelan Smith
is serving time for that. Yeah, and that was used actually in the evidence. The criminality side of it, to say that he was such an important member of the Hutch gang that the Kinahan gang made these huge efforts to try and kill him. Presumably an expensive plot involving Estonian hitmen and then their own hit team a month later, when there's surely, a lot of Garda attention on all the various people involved, that they still tried to go ahead with it. So, I mean, that was used as a kind of another, I suppose, thread in the evidence, that here's a guy who's a senior player. And I mean, and there were, the evidence was pretty much, it was straightforward, in terms of a senior member of the Hutch gang who make their money from armed robberies and the importation of drugs. So, I mean, and they kind of went through some of the various criminal acts that Mago had been linked to, which included a Tiger robbery and other robberies. He had some convictions for relatively minor robberies. They linked him to 3 different murders as well. Which was, which I suppose kind of spoke to his reputation and his standing within gangland as well, which was all used against him as kind of another layer.
Name those murders?
Oh yeah. I mean, during the case, the Criminal Assets Bureau linked him to 3 different murders that he would have been arrested and questioned over the murder of Eamon the Don Dunn, not suggesting necessarily that he was directly involved, but, supplying phones or giving someone aid or cars and this sort of stuff. And then you had a criminal called Aidan Byrne who was killed, and this guy called Jonathan Ukad Douglas was convicted and sentenced to life of that. So he was linked to that as well. And of course then the third murder was David Byrne in the infamous Regency hotel attack.
And of course James Mago Gately could once have been described as, if a proceeds of crime case had been taken 10 years ago, he probably would have been described as a member of the Kinahan organised crime group, because he was a very close friend of Gary Hutch, and was basically living out in Spain and was central to the Kinahan organised crime group before it all went wrong. Yeah,
and his business partner in his beauticians is another figure that is part of the Kinahan cartel. And they basically wound down the business because of that. And he said as much in, I think, an interview with the guards in Dundalk. As part of this investigation, he, I think, allowed himself to be interviewed and, made some, he was given different accounts of how he had his money or where it came from. And this was part of it where it came up. So, I mean, that was... that kind of we've known that the Kinahan Hutch feud is really a civil war. They were already an enmeshed criminal network, and there was a big falling out, and kind of, I suppose, the family unit of that formed part of that wider international gang. That family unit, the Hutches based in Dublin 1, separated very much, and Mago Gately went with them.
And which is why I was kind of referring to the house being, if you had to lose something, probably that would be a favourable asset to lose, because would he ever have been able to live there comfortably again? He was a part of the Kinahan organised crime group. He was friends with Daniel Kinahan and others. They all knew where he lived, where he was based. That threat, while the Kinahan Hutch feud has completely abated, touch wood, there hasn't been a murder since, I think, 2017. Does that threat ever fully abate? And if you were sitting, kicking back, living in your house in Coolock where they all knew you lived, are you sitting duck? Could you ever relax?
Yeah, well, I think there's a clue in the fact that he had a heavy steel door installed. And again, Owens mentions he referred to it as protective perspex sheeting over the front windows, whether that was, I suppose, to stop bricks or pipe bombs or petrol bombs or stuff like that, So, I mean, obviously he didn't feel too comfortable there.
Fought for it anyway, as most people will, against the Criminal Assets Bureau, They don't like losing their hard-earned money.
No, and there will be, and there's going to be more, there'll be costs awarded, I'd say, at the next hearing. I mean, the next step, of course, would be to appoint a receiver, and then there'll be, basically a date organised when they'll take full possession of the house, and then at some point it'll go on the market, the same as we saw some of them. There was quite a number of sales recently, so it'll follow that route.
He's not such an evident figure these days. I mean, I think the last we saw of him, he was back in Dublin with Patrick Hutch, in the company of Patrick Hutch. He was photographed having a cup of coffee and sort of declaring that, this was his city again. Probably was around 2018. But so he's shot out at the petrol station by Caelan Smith in May of 2017. He's rushed to hospital. He's in pretty bad nick. Yeah,
he was shot in the neck. And I mean, the 4 bullets hit the ballistic vest, the bulletproof vest he was wearing.
Which saved him, obviously.
Which obviously did, yeah. I mean, it was I suppose, as close as you can get to being killed. And I mean, although he did turn up recently enough. He was arrested in Donegal at a guarded checkpoint over a road traffic offence. So he'd be going through the courts on that. Like, he seemed to have kind of set up a life elsewhere. I mean, it was mentioned
over the border. I mean, in April of 2017, when Imre Arakas was going to kill him, he was living in Newry in an apartment up there. And I think in May of 2017, when he was shot out at the petrol station, he had been home to that house to visit Charlotte Lam, his partner, and had been followed from there, or perhaps there was another tracker on the car. I can't remember at that stage. But, obviously then 2018, the cab case reveals that he's bobbing around. What sea is Japan on? Yeah.
I mean, well, it was quite the holiday. Eye-watering was the phrase used, I think, in eye-watering luxury.
Trip of a lifetime. Maybe if you've survived two assassination attempts.
Well, it was his second trip of a lifetime.
Was it?
So maybe, I suppose, you feel like you got 9 lives when you've been shot at and survived. I mean, but he obviously was trying hard to keep in the move, because one of the kind of, it's just stuck in my mind that one of the things they found in the house in Coolock when they searched it was a fake reference, which was for a landlord of a property in Belfast where he was trying to get a tenancy. So he was trying to move in. So, I mean, it kind of shows you the trouble that I suppose some of these high profile guys have if they're trying to keep a low profile and even finding somewhere to live, that they can keep it on the straight and narrow without attracting attention. I mean, when you're faking a landlord reference, like you're kind of...
But it must be a nightmare having to stay on the move, on the run, with family, you have kids perhaps in school, your own relatives. You can't bring everybody with you. And it's expensive to keep on the move.
Yeah, but there seem to be, substantial funds. I mean, like, if 440,000 worth of refurbishment being done professionally, like, it wasn't done on the cheap, all the materials involved. I mean, Judge Owens was using, words like overwhelmingly and exotic lifestyle and subsidized by their proceeds of crime. There was no shortage of money. There seemed to be a constant topping up of these accounts that were then being used for so-called legitimate purposes, like, whether it was, for booking flights or for paying rent or gym membership and this sort of thing.
They were just their living expenses, really.
Yeah, but there was no, and he makes the point, there was no real evidence of living expenses on these accounts. So they were using other money all the time, for basic stuff. Now, sometimes there was living expenses, but generally there wasn't. There could be a single purchase of a coffee or something like that in Valencia, or it could be in Poland, or I mean, there was. I think they went to Key Camp in Treviso, Lake Garda. I think at one point, like, there was evidence that their cards were used there, and some of it then they didn't actually find details of what they spent on the flights from their accounts. Instead, they found it from the airlines, and they were able to see, whatever, like €700 was spent on flights to Wroclaw or, wherever they went, Manchester, Poland. Like, there was a whole list of, there was a lot of travel. And, as the judge says, they were barely in the country during that period.
So it's interesting what was said then or declared before the courts about the Hutch organised crime group, because in the Regency Hotel trial of Jerry the Monk Hutch for the murder of David Byrne, there was evidence given by David Gallagher from the Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau. And that was the first time I think we publicly heard, or in a court of law, that there is a Hutch organised crime group. It was the first time it had been mentioned. And he just said it was a sort of he described it as a familial grouping with a patriarchal leadership. And he said that it was fluid, that sometimes they came together to work together, but other times they were working, individually. So I don't think that there was a mention of drugs or the exact kind of business, but just that it was an organised crime group. But obviously the CAB proceedings have gone a step further and described them as an international drug group.
Yeah, well, I mean, they said armed robbery and the distribution of drugs or importation of drugs.
Right.
So, I mean...
So they're not an international group then, they'd be a...
Well, we know they're an international group because Gary Hutch was,
in Spain
Spain, and it was all part and parcel of the Kinahan group at that stage. So there were certainly members of the Hutch organised crime gang or group.
They're distributing drugs in this country as opposed to importing them into Europe. Or did they detail that?
No, they didn't detail that. But it did say importation of drugs. So presumably they're coming from outside the country if they're importing them, whether it's from the UK or Spain or Holland or South America. That wasn't specified in the case. But it's certainly, if you go back to like what you said, in terms of they are a diverse group, even though they're a family group, and we know some of them are getting into trouble for very minor crimes and nuisance crimes and that sort of thing. And then, of course, at the apex, then you have Jerry the Monk Hutch, who was, carried out masterminded these legendary heists in Dublin, stealing millions of pounds and euro, whatever, and successfully investing it all then in property. So, even with Mago Gately, when they're going through like his criminality, at one point, 20 years or a bit less than 20 years ago, he was involved in stealing motorbikes, high-powered motorbikes, and they believe he was the guy behind a spate of these robberies in Dublin at the time. So stealing motorbikes was obviously an income stream for an individual who was part of the wider Hutch organised crime group at the time. And then, of course, he was pals with Gary Hutch, who was out in Spain doing his own drug deals. And then they were involved in tiger kidnaps and bank robberies and, linked to murders. And these murders would have occurred when he would have only been 24, 23. Like, he was a young man. Like, he was a hardened criminal or, a senior gangland figure at that age.
Entrusted with whatever role he had to play in those murders. It's interesting, though, to look at the Hutch organised crime group and how it's developed really in one generation, perhaps. So Jerry the Monk Hutch would have long certainly put out a narrative that he was anti-drugs. Of course, back in the day when he was working with the provos and, had close relations with them anyway, he would have always insisted on that. Now, he would also be seen as the head of this Hutch organised crime group, which has been described as a drug distribution network. So we're getting closer really to maybe the truth of the Hutch story with that. But that generation, while Jerry the Monk Hutch has no convictions in relation to drug trafficking, the next generation down, Gary Hutch, Mago Gately, are certainly Gary Hutch was clearly a drug dealer. He was described as just underneath Daniel Kinahan in the Kinahan organised crime group. But this Hutch organised crime group, which has now been labelled, has come out from under the wing of the Kinahan group, went to battle with it, and now exists as a independent organisation.
Yeah, or elements within it. I mean, it's quite possible there's members of the Hutch family, who have chosen to go down that route through their own contacts, of importing drugs. And while Jerry Hutch, may be seen as the patriarch or the guy that, has ultimate say-so in terms of a collective effort, he might have no control over what guys are doing on their own bat, which wouldn't be the first time. Because we know kind of the pattern of gangs, certainly in Dublin. You can have multiple groups where people swap between, different things. Like if there's a particular type of crime or job going to be done, they hook up with a certain person and they get someone else to do the distribution or the sales or the importation of drugs or get weapons or cars or whatever it is they're doing, or to attack someone. And you have different people doing different things. I mean, they are, like, by their nature, to some extent, they're loose arrangements between a tight-knit group, if that makes sense. It's, you got to be in, I suppose. You've got to be, a trusted individual. And then once you are, you can be, you can be offered multi-roles, or you can find multi-roles for yourself with different people and partner up with different people at different times. And that's the way I think a lot of kind of the modern adaptive gangs are. And
there was an inevitability that the Hutch grouping was going to move towards drugs, and an utter inevitability and naivety to consider that it wasn't. When you look back to when Jerry Hutch was, linked to those big armed robberies, while armed robberies still occur and tiger kidnaps still occur, they're usually for funding to purchase wholesale drugs, because that's where the real profits are. You know, criminal groupings are no longer happy with just pocketing what they make from an armed robbery, mostly.
Yeah.
They will invest it.
And we know, sometimes it's not even armed robbery, it's simple fraud, or it's, or it's ringing of stolen cars, or whatever it is. Or, it's prostitution. There's so many income streams that a criminal gang, once they have, the wherewithal to set up, whether it's organising or licensing people to set up grow houses on their patch, or to finance someone else to go and do it, and you take a cut, you outsource, you set up contractors to do your dirty work for you. And that's the way they work. And like any successful business, they're going to have multiple different ways of making money. And then, to some extent, I suppose, if you're putting all your money in the one pot, it's a bad business practice. So it's a bad criminal practice as well to say, to put everything in on one roll of the dice to get 1,000 kilos of cocaine into Ireland. So you're going to partner up with other gangs if you can. You're going to kind of split the risk and do it over 3 goes, and and you're going to still have your other go-to criminal activities that people like to do, whether it's stolen electronics, or forging documents, or dodgy mortgages. There's just endless. Tobacco, your favourite.
Did Mago Gately show up at all?
No, we didn't see him. And of course, they were represented in court. So, and there's no reason, or you don't have to turn up at these hearings as a respondent. Some people do because, I don't know, they want to see their hard-earned money, or non-hard-earned money, being used by a lawyer.
I think they see it as hard-earned.
They do see it as hard-earned, of course, but they want to see they're getting value for money if they're going to get stuck with the bill. But it's kind of... It's interesting to see who turns up sometimes in these cases. And sometimes it's the kind of, I suppose, I would suspect it's the more slightly naive, softer criminals, and that the genuine hardcore people, like the likes of the Waldrons, never turned up, the likes of Mago Gately, never to be seen. I
did sit with Derek Butler Devoy.
Did you?
Yeah, he did. He was, I think they relieved him of 100,000 at one point, and I was covering the cab list at the time, and he came in with his mother.
All right, as you do.
His mother kept saying to him, "There's Nicola Talent."
All right, he didn't know who you were, but the mother did.
No, he did. I'd say he was fit to kill her. She was mortifying him. Yeah. And then she was waving over at me, and I was saying hello.
Didn't look for an autograph or anything, no?
No,
there you go. You're a celebrity.
Nudging her to tell her to
shut up. You're embarrassing me, Ma.
You're embarrassing me, Ma. Anyway, just these funny little things.
I'm afraid nothing like that has happened to me. Obviously, I'm not as recognisable as you, thankfully.
I shouldn't be laughing so hard at that. But, those 3 murders, and he's 24, that he's linked to, the most high profile of them, well, obviously David Byrne at the Regency Hotel, but Eamon the Don Dunn, killed in the Fossa House pub in 2010 while sitting having a drink. I mean, he was a liability at that point to everybody. He had gone a bit crazy, had murdered a lot of people, was going through that paranoia, moving about, staying in caravans, etc. There was an inevitability to his murder. But at that point in 2010, when he's murdered, James Mago Gately, who's linked to this murder, would have been
24, I think, yeah.
24 and working with the Kinahan organised crime group. So the suggestion that Eamon the Don Dunn was taken out by the Kinahan network, or just with their sanction?
We've heard everything really, that there was 3 kind of major groups kind of coalesced and thought, look, it's time to get him out of the way. And the fact that there was a kind of a relatively smooth handover of business to the 2 Waldrons then, immediately after. And that is something that came out in the cab cases against the Waldrons, that they very much took over the business following the murder of Eamon the Don Dunn. There was no suggestion that they were directly involved in any way with the murder, but they basically took over the patch where he had been selling drugs, like in that kind of Cabra
little bit area. Of a poison chalice, that area, given that it all was started off by PJ Judge, who was taken out, and Martin Marlowe Hyland stood in to take over. and Martin Marlowe Hyland was taken out, and Eamon the Don Dunn stood in to take over. I'm not sure I'd be that comfortable.
No, I mean, you do wonder, like, why would you stick around? I mean, maybe the Waldrons are right in buying a nice house down in Wexford.
Now, the Waldrons are, 15 years?
They were, it would have been,
murder?
Yeah. And I mean, and that case rocked up again this week, even though we know that one house belonging to them has been sold off, and I think but that was Christopher who'd settled his case, and then David's houses, he's one in Leixlip, one in Ratoath, and the big mansion then Darview Heights that you got the fabulous pics of and all the rest. And it turned last month we know that there was something like 6,300 in rent for Darview Heights and Leixlip for the River Forest house, still being paid to a Spanish bank account where David Waldron was living. A month, yeah. And so that was said last month. So
he has it rented out and someone's paying
he has it rented out, yeah. And there was a man named in court, I think a Lithuanian gentleman, as being in receipt, that he was paying the rent and paying it into a Spanish account. And they said Waldron was now estranged from his wife, who's also called Charlene, by the way. And she's living in the Ratoath house. And then they said there was 13 people in the, whatever it is, the 3 or 4 bed house in River Forest in Leixlip. And the judge says, well, I can't give a possession order on these until we get, we need to know all the occupants have been notified. So what we got yesterday then was a guard giving evidence, like it wasn't affidavit evidence. He actually gave evidence in the court that he'd served letters to the 13 people, and that the guy who was living in Darview, I can't pronounce his name, but it's actually in our website. Bubnis is his surname. And it's on SundayWorld.com. You can look it up. And David Waldron rent,
paying nearly 7,000 a month rent.
So he was collecting, but he was collecting from the 13. So we don't know what the 13 people were paying this man, but he was then paying the rent for Darview and the rent for the house in Leixlip that he had subletted. So the fact that it was ordered that this money now had to be paid over the cab, it couldn't keep going on to the Spanish bank account. But so we found out then, no, that hasn't happened. It's still going to Spain. There was some talk of lawyers coming off record, and that there was new solicitors going to be involved with respect to an appeal, is what the way it was phrased, and that like herself and her husband's interests no longer align, was the carefully worded way it was put in court. So she's going to be
for all that.
She lives in Ratoath House, so I mean there's always that little bit extra of I suppose they go the extra length when it's a family home. So you're talking about children being made homeless or being forced to move, like, during the school year and all the rest of it. And again, this comes up all the time, like, where a judge, if it's a family home, will say, well, you have till the 1st of September, like, to get out, because that'll give you time to go and find a new place and enroll your kids in school, if that argument has been used. So it's one of those things. But I mean, it's in the long run, it's pretty much inevitable, even if...
In the long run, I suppose, but to get to that very end position, there's so many obstacles put in the way, isn't there, for the state? Like, because the state has to play fair all the time.
Yeah, and properly so. And they do go to huge lengths to put forward this evidence. And Judge Owens doesn't give them all their own way. And I mean, we saw it even with, say, in the Ross Browning case, there was money borrowed by his mother, Julia Conway, that they put into Chestnut Lodge, and he said, like, whatever the proceeds of sale that relate to whatever the value you can make out of the proceeds of sale, which we now know went for around $500,000. So that money is going back to them. What they put into it, because that wasn't proceeds of crime. So I mean, he does nitpick the evidence, and and will only rely on the evidence that is filed properly and is sworn as is proper. So I mean. And it should be that way. I mean, you can't have the guards or any arm of the state just rocking up and saying, "Oh, that's the proceeds of crime. We're having that." Like, I mean, they need to go through. They need to do it properly, and the legislation is pretty much in their favour with the switch of the onus of proof on the people being targeted by CAB. I'm not saying it makes it easier, but it changes. Like, the whole it was a total game changer in Ireland. From the mid-90s on, the fact that you can't just have loads of wealth and say, well, you prove it's criminal money that did it. Now it's the other way around. You have to show that you did it through legitimate means.
Exactly. So anyway, we'll bid farewell to Mago Gately for the moment, and That'll be another house we can have a snoop around when it goes up online.
Well, it could be a while yet, because he didn't actually make any orders until they come back to him on this last bit about whether there are any payments.
If they can
so
prove, if
there was
there's
a whole
legitimate money that they've earned that has gone into that house, he may make an order in the same way as he did in the Browning case, that they get that bit back on sale if they do come up with that. But that's the last hurdle then he's indicated.
Yeah, and the same, of course, with Yan Yan Fan, the designer collection lady who was allegedly...
What did she get back? I saw that.
You put me on the spot now. About 14 items, some of which she had said in her affidavit evidence were worthless, including an Apple keyboard and a Mockler coat and stuff like that. Montclair coat, sorry.
Right.
Not Mockler, that's a surname in parts of the Midlands. But whoops, it wouldn't be as expensive, I'd imagine.
No, wouldn't be. But so she got those few bits back.
Well, they were ordered to be returned, so I'm not sure how long it takes. And I think there was €89,000 as well of the cash that they were trying to seize, which I think of a total of 229,000. There was something like 89 was to be returned to her parents in China, because he was satisfied that the evidence that she had produced showed that the money did come from there.
Evidence, wasn't there, that they had sent money, she had bought a house, she'd sold that house, she'd bought another apartment, whatever, and then she'd, of course, is she still working on BTs?
No, well, we shouldn't laugh about this now, you're not to laugh, but she turned up in court.
And stop, you can't.
And she wasn't happy with the judgment, and he was trying to explain to her, look, you'll have to appeal and all the rest, and look, the judgment's final and you got something back and I can't do any more for you. And kind of mentioned again, you'd go for appeal. And then she said, and you have to do something about the journalist. Like, I went to buy ice cream with my kid and he's ruined my life. And then she said, Cab has ruined her life.
That was you.
And well, I don't know who she was referring to, but I think we're the only people that have published her picture and written about it. So she says, she wanted an order from the court to stop journalists writing about it, but he said he can't do that. He suggested that she stop reading it.
Yeah.
And I won't say any more, I don't think, on the whole issue. But
the job.
She wasn't happy.
The job in BTs?
No, she said she couldn't get a job anywhere now, and that Cab had ruined her life. And that rightly pointed out she hadn't been convicted of any crime. But I mean, that's the whole point of the Proceeds of Crime Act. You're not necessarily you're not being convicted of a crime. But you can't live off the proceeds of crime. And it was alleged, and the argument was made by Cab, that she was involved in grow houses. He didn't accept all the evidence. Mm-hmm. And there was a grow house in Cork, which he said, look, just because her car that she sometimes used was seen in the area, which was a long way away from the grow house, doesn't mean she was linked to that one. Mm-hmm. But he said the one on Henrietta Place, that was, last month he said all this. He said, she could not have known what was going on. Like she was subletting it, and seemed to be quite competent in looking after her, her own accounts and all the rest. So and she was a trained accountant. But then she was saying that because of the publicity around the case, that she can't get a professional job, and it's kind of tough.
Well, that maybe is tough if you can't get a job. Especially when you're trying to go straight.
She's no fan of mine.
So she's no fan of yours. But I mean, look, we're entitled to talk about these cases. And, in the end of the day, it's in the public interest. The taxpayer funds the whole operation of the Criminal Assets Bureau, along with, the court system, the justice system. We stand by as a democratic country. And I think it's important for people to know what's going on. They're also bloody interesting, these cases.
Yeah, I mean, you really get an insight into stuff. I mean, it's you get a glimpse of basically the Garda intelligence files that otherwise wouldn't be brought out anywhere, and if they're accepted by the judge, it's been accepted by High Court in on the balance of probabilities that
It helps us do our job a little bit easier as well, because you can talk a little bit freer about things that we might know, but obviously because of legal constraints we can't. There's been a lot of people, over the last few years that have been named in the Proceeds of Crime cases. I mean, I think in actual fact, Daniel Kinahan was named as the head of the Kinahan Organised Crime Group by the Criminal Assets Bureau in Dublin. Yeah. And that allowed quite a lot of media organisations, even in the UK, they legally felt they could go forward then and delve into. And
I think it was a key moment in stopping his attempt to sports wash his reputation through the boxing world. That, here's the Irish High Court, it's been accepted that this is a man involved in an international drugs cartel. Yeah, yeah.
And the little insight, I suppose, as well into this lifestyle and the kind of money there is, because we talk about, money, this amount of drugs was seized, it's worth such and such, but you're actually calculating it down to what sort of things they can afford, like that cruise in Japan. You're probably,
the eye-watering cruise.
What,
yeah.
20, 30,000
I have no idea.
per person?
It's massive money. And I'd say it's as much as you want to spend depending on, what room, whether it's
Japan
got a window, whether it has a balcony.
Like 3 times as expensive as any of the other exotic holiday destinations.
Well, you could take your packed lunch from the ship with you.
You could,
if you were trying to penny pinch on your...
By the sounds of it, they weren't. But anyway, we shall bid farewell to Mago Gately for the moment until he shows up next. So thanks a million, Eamon.
Always a pleasure, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.